Well, I think this auction is going to be a lot of fun, don't you think? Let's talk a little bit about Frazetta. I wrote my first essay about Frank in 1979. I was 29 years old. I'm 65 years old now, so what's that? 35 years of writing about Frank Frazetta? There's a lot still to say about him. Let me go back to my very first undergraduate class. It was an anthropology class. I walked into the room. The professor was talking about what is the nature of man, when did man begin? He started talking about bones and stones and archival remains and all sorts of things, skeletons. And at the end of the class, he had absolutely no idea when man began. He said there's a fossil record, the fossil record is incomplete, so we have absolutely no idea when man began. So it was very confusing. That afternoon I walked into a philosophy class. I asked my philosophy professor, I said, we were talking about where man begins in anthropology. What do you have to say about that? And he said, oh, it's very, very simple. He said, all you have to do is read G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton said, art is the signature of man. Where you find art, that's where you find man. So in other words, when you go to the cave paintings in Lascaux, the cave paintings in Altamira in Spain, all these very, very, very early secret caves that had all this wonderful, wonderful art on the walls. If you ask an anthropologist, he'll say, oh, these are places for secret ceremonies. Very strange things were done here. My philosophy professor said, well, maybe there were secret ceremonies there, but it could have been just somebody decorating a kid's room, trying to keep a child from being scared late at night. Simple as that. What we do know is that at some point in history, a man started to draw. He started to create art. And that's when art history began, and that's when man first appeared. Now, Frank Frazetta is interesting because he is in that long line of tradition. He goes all the way back to those cave paintings. What is art? It's a flow of soul. I've said that many, many times. I'm probably not the first one to say it. I'm not plagiarizing it because I never looked it up. I always thought that was an appropriate way to talk about it. It's a flow of soul. It's a man's internal creative energies wanting to express themselves. And so therefore they express themselves in art. And so whether you have Raphael or Michelangelo or Vermeer or Rembrandt, all the medieval painters, anybody you can think of who's a great artist, that whole tradition of art history is based on a flow of soul and a human being trying to communicate to another human being. That's where Frazetta should be placed. He shouldn't be placed in some kind of artificial category. He's not a science fiction artist. He's not a fantasy artist. He's not a comic strip artist. He's not a comic book artist. He's all that plus more. He transcends all those categories. That's what really makes Frank special. Not also to mention the fact that he does all this out of his imagination. Look at all these incredible pieces behind me. Every single one came out of Frank's unconscious, working with his deep subconscious, just trying to give expression to various kinds of ideas. It didn't matter if he was illustrating a text from Edgar Rice Burroughs, because he would take that text only as a starting point for a great piece of art. I've written about all this all over the place, so you can look it up. You can see what I have to say about Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, and why it's way, way beyond just a little picture of Tarzan and a bunch of natives. It really does transcend that category quite a bit. So in any case, that's why Frazetta is very, very significant, because he has to be placed in that long tradition of art history. And there's really not many people you can compare him to. There were great painters in art history, and Frank is a great painter among great painters. However, as a pen and ink artist, as a person who was using pen and ink, brush, and India ink, I don't think he has a rival. I think his works are unparalleled. I've seen Joseph Clement Cole, I've seen Daniel Vierge, I've seen Fortunino Matania, I've seen them all, I've looked at them all, I've owned them all. There's nothing like these Frazetta pieces. They just go beyond that. There's a life, there's an energy, there's a soul, there's an impact, there's a presence that you just don't feel in all of these other artists. You know, let me go back to my undergraduate days very briefly once again. One of my replacement professors for a Buddhism class was Allen Ginsberg. Some of you might know Allen Ginsberg from the 1950s, where he was a beatnik. and he was one of the first countercultural people, and he really was anti-establishment. And he hung out with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gregory Corso, Jack Kerouac, all of these people. In the 60s, he was good friends with Bob Dylan. Well, during my undergraduate years, I was writing a major paper about Bob Dylan, and I happened to catch Alan after one of the classes, and I said, Mr. Ginsberg, I said, you're good friends with Bob Dylan. How really good is he? Can you express it? Can you explain it to me? And Alan looked at me, had a little twinkle in his eye, very intense stare, and he said, let me tell you something. You don't know how good Bob Dylan is. I don't know how good Bob Dylan is. Bob Dylan doesn't know how good Bob Dylan is. That's how good he is. And I always thought, that's the perfect way to describe Frazetta. I really don't know how good he is. You all don't know how really good he is. Frank certainly doesn't know how good he is. That's how amazingly good he really is. He transcends all those abilities to try to talk about him, to categorize him, to put him in some kind of a neat little pigeonhole, to put him in a book. He's really well beyond that. So that's really the significance of Frazetta. I just wanted to just say a few words about that. In any case, all of these pieces will be gone in a little while. I've enjoyed them for decades. Other people are now going to enjoy them. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.